You know, SAJE is putting together a series of short videos where we are celebrating mentorship in jazz and jazz education. Outside of the formal jazz education and particularly higher education setting, we have this opportunity to celebrate mentors who have guided and who have helped shape the careers of so many musicians in South Africa. Like I said to you before we started, if all we achieve in this session is hearing your stories and your entry into jazz and also into jazz education, because you are both jazz educators and you are both contributing. Yes, you may be in the formal setting right now, but even although I haven't asked you this question, I am sure that you were mentored early in your careers and early in your education journeys. And that's what we really would love to hear about from both of you, Nduduzo Makhathini and Sakhile Simani. You need very little introduction. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to have you both join us.
Thank you. Well, I think it's truly a special moment that you have created here as SHAE, and I think it's quite an important ensemble of themes and ideas that you want us to actually touch on. If we were to think just for a moment in terms of the historical events and how jazz would come to South Africa, would realize that it came through the ports, and at the time people really picked it up by ear, right? And of course that formed part of the informal kind of training, right? And over many years, this history has written itself. And of course, in 1980, thereabout, the first ever jazz program was initiated in UKZN, and it would draw from this well of musicians that were already trained in these informal settings. But something interesting happens in this moment. On the one hand, there is this newly discovered way of training jazz musicians, which is great. This is what has given birth to people like myself. I come later in that legacy. But on the other hand, when we look at the informal, there's this kind of discontinuity that starts to happen. People don't really have to listen that much to the masters in the township, because all of a sudden you can go and enroll in a jazz program elsewhere. So while this kind of dynamic is taking place, I think now we're at a moment where we're looking at the legacies of such a problem. For instance, in the 90s, then people like Babzi Mngwane started graduating, that were also grappling with this idea of formal and informal. So they started seeing themselves as a product of the informal while having gone through the formal. So in recent years, at least with my generation, we're starting to think about what is a way of creating space in the formal for informal, or even the problematicness of using such terms. So I think this is a really important moment. It happens at the right time. And of course, these conversations happen at the backdrop of decolonial conversations. And I feel jazz is central in those conversations. And of course, this decolonial conversation is really about the question of what counts as our indigenous knowledge systems. And I guess what we're also trying to speak about today is how much does then jazz as an art form in South Africa, how much does it borrow from the kind of pre-colonial histories? And I think I'm very passionate about that question. A lot of what I represent really delves into that. And I think for an introduction, I think that's where my thinking is.
Nduduzo, you touched on a very important conversation that is currently happening and that will continue to happen for a very long time in jazz education, specifically in higher education, where you and I are both situated. And it is also a very exciting time in terms of recurriculation, because I think with this kind of thinking and with this kind of breaking down also of of the silos and barriers and the sort of separatist approach that we've seen in education and in jazz education provides an opportunity for us to rethink how we merge the formal with the informal, and even how we define what is formal learning and what is informal learning, and what does that mean? Before we go to Sakhile, maybe you want to just continue with that idea to also revisit where it started for you.
Of course, I lean on a legacy that was cultivated by my ancient ancestors. So in terms of my own personal journey, I of course come from the Zionist Church. I come from the deep rural of KZN, Emakongo, and of course jazz is something that I encountered very late in my life. So for instance, I don't have like a story about my grandfather or grandmother who played records. I don't have a story about anyone in the township that played instruments. I don't have those stories, but the story for me is encountering the curriculum and now being in that moment that questions what counts as music literacy, for instance. So when I went to UKZN, of course, the audition was based on assessing my music literacy. And of course, through that audition, it was decided that I have to do preaching course because I do not have any musical background. And of course, this is where it starts to become problematic for me already, because all of these things that I count, music from my people, all of this counts as a musical background. So I think for me, I cannot divorce the historic versus the present and how I'm located. And I'm part of those legacies that have been problematic. But of course, that the brighter side of it is at least we are able to speak about it. But I think it's important that we speak about it in the most honest way and discuss really the problems of jazz education in this country. I've addressed this elsewhere on a paper called The Politics of Formal and Informal Jazz in South Africa in post-94. But of course, this is a much more open setting. I'm talking to a friend. I'm talking to someone that I've played music with, but I think it's just important to be cognizant of what really it means.
And it's so personal as well, all of these things that you're bringing up. And I think as a jazz educator myself, it's also wonderful to know that, you are also in a position like I am, where we have the opportunity to rethink these things. And it is our responsibility as educators, whether we're teaching in schools like Sakhile is, whether we're teaching at university, all of the kind of so-called informal teaching and mentoring that we all do. And I think it is an exciting time because it does allow for ideas like the ideas that you bring now to this discussion. It also doesn't mean, therefore, we get rid of everything that was historically offered to students, like the discussion around decolonization. It doesn't have to necessarily mean that we get rid of everything that was and we make space only for that which is new. But the point is we make the space for situations, people, genres, sounds, thought processes, ways of thinking, ways of playing, ways of learning, ways of archiving, but that we make the space for that in education. How do we as educators, create that opportunity? But I'm going to pause there for a moment. I'd like to bring Sakhile in. Where did it start for you in your journey with jazz education? Like Nduduzo, you've also studied in a formal setting at an institution, but before that, I know you have a long history of the Salvation Army, some field band foundation. What did that mean for you as a young person getting into jazz and also a young person seeking an education?
Hello, Debbie. Hello, Nduduzo. Firstly, I would love to be thankful about this opportunity that you guys are inviting me here. this is really important for SHAE to capture these. It started the Salvation Army here in Mdantsane. Back in the days, I used to be a soccer player. So in the field that we were also do trainings, it was opposite the church. So there was this guy, Duqwabe, came in to look for young players to come and learn music. Then we were just not interested until he picked up the trumpet and just play. And he just, I still remember that day, he just played, he played anything. I think he was improvising. Then we were like falling in love with this thing. And this thing is it's kind of distanced to us because we saw these things in TVs and also as well listening to them in radios. So I was captured by that. Fortunately, I was the one young person who continued with that music. In the Salvation Army, we mostly played hymns. It's really good for the brass player to play hymns because you play more slowly, more confident. So as a brass player, it really teaches you like how to control your sound production, to have a good, very round, bold sound when you play the trumpet. Then I think I was playing a French horn. Then I graduated because of my process. So I was dedicated on this thing and I loved it. And I was getting support from my mom as well. So I graduated to play a cornet. Then I went to join the field band foundation, where there was like 120 kids with trumpets, trombones, tubas, dancers, marimbas. So it was that vibe. So you play, you dance, you move, you count. So it was more in the field set up. So I was not actually into that, but I was willing to learn. Then 2007, that's where I was graduated with the Field Band Foundation. Then I decided to go to enrolled in UKZN in 2008. So with my brother, with my family supporting me in this thing because I was winning awards, right, with the Field Band Foundation. So my brother told me, man, if you really love this thing, I think you need to get into university. You need to go and study. You need to have more vocabulary about the thing.
And how do you think that informed what you're doing now as a teacher? You're teaching at Sterling High School, right? So those experiences that you had in the field band and the way in which you received the music and you received the teaching from your mentors there, how do you think that informs your role as a teacher now?
I was actually fortunate to be one of Budulama Gaulana's student. He passed away last year. May his soul rest in peace. And also Toli Koduga as well. He also passed away in 2018. So I was so fortunate to be part of that. They really taught me. Then back in the days, I didn't understand the teaching part out of this. Now I understand that they were so really patient with teaching. Sometimes you really have to be patient with your student. Sometimes things are not gonna come at the very moment. So you have to really look up to the future, right? So you really have to be patient when it comes to teaching. So I learned that from my masters back in the days. But now I'm also fortunate. Now I'm also teaching. I'm also giving back to the students as well. But that no, if you're not gonna get it now, tomorrow is another day. It's gonna be different. Next week's gonna be another day. Next month is gonna be better. So
I just have one question for you both, and that is, what's in the water in the Eastern Cape that this region produces such amazing musicians? Where is it that people are getting into it right in the beginning, in their early years, before they go, to schools, to high schools, to higher education? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
Yeah. So I came particularly, my interest was in the broader music industry. I had seen a lot of musicians come out of the Eastern Cape. And of course, I knew that there was a number of them that went to study in UKZN. And so for me, it came as a different kind of response to why aren't the musicians able to do it from the Eastern Cape. So I came up here because there was a big question about the industry. How do the people in the Eastern Cape set up an industry that would lessen this kind of recurring movement of musicians being discovered from the Eastern Cape, but leaving the Eastern Cape for good and never coming back. And we've seen that with a lot of them. So I came from a different context where I was here to help what was then called the ECAVC, which was a record company, which was documenting the legacies of musicians here. But also I was mentoring a lot of them under a record company. And also now I've been teaching and mentoring a lot of students.
With that question, if we can take back the history from 1930, where it all started in Queenstown. Then Queenstown was named as Legal Jazz Town. So the musicians that were there, the late Bet Machikiza, then Mongezi Feza, came into the Buffalo City. Then that's where he met Johnny Gianni. Then after that, we go into the coastal from East London, King Williamstown. That's where the Slow Food King Brothers. If I'm not mistaken, that was 1950s, right? King Williamstown is not far away from the coastal, but if you go to the coastal, then you go straight to Grahamstown, then PE. Then PE, there was a soul jazzman, Dudley Tito, Ontena, what was the drama? Peter Jackson. That's where Opera Fair comes from. That's where Tatuzim Ngawana comes from. That's where most of the great PE guys come from that institution, soul jazzman. Nah, yes, Fats Mbambisa, Utete Mbambisa. I'm sorry about these names, but we're gonna edit Debbie, Tex Nduluka, my master Tex Nduluka. So they formed a group called Vuka. Then Vuka as well, before Putayanda started, they produced Upudulama Kaulana. Upudulama Kaulana went to play with Utete Mbambisa's trio. So that's where history, if I'm not mistaken, that's where history began. Then Upudulama Kaulana produced Ayanda Sikate and also myself.
Yeah.
So that's where the history is.
But you see what I mean? I mean, no, we're not going to edit out all these names. Like, this is a journey through South African jazz history right there. And it all happens in the Eastern Cape, right? Which is not to say that it doesn't happen elsewhere. But I mean, but there's this beautiful, rich legacy that's happening in this region. And, you know, and I think it's also so exciting for the both of you that, Sakhile, yes, you come from there and now you've sort of come full circle and you've gone back there. And Nduduzo, you, as you said, you didn't start there, but you've landed up there now. So Sakhile, maybe this is a great moment for us to wrap up on these thoughts and these ideas that have come through already.
For an institution and a high school, so it's totally different worlds, right? I'm also teaching informally in Tanzania and formally at Sterling. So the future looks really bright, but there are differences in between. It pains me at times when I'm coming from the informal. I try to teach my students, right? But there's not much of a resources. When it comes to this world, everything's there, right? For instance, if I go to Hudson Park, they've got their own music department. They've got 10 teachers. So each teacher focuses on each instrument: piano, brass, guitar, drums, and so forth. And these students, they get to learn really, really fast. Where I come from in Tanzania, we've got lack of resources. We don't have time. Most of the students here, they don't have instruments, right? So if you get to see it, what about I was talking about progression? They don't have instruments. They don't have their instrument to take home with, to go and practice. So the time is limited. Even if they are so talented, for example, if I'm going to the Salvation Army, I'm going to go and teach students. They are willing to learn, and they learn fast, and also they are talented, but the resources with instruments, with books are not there. So right. I don't know whether the departments that arts and culture, they should also do something about these things. I've got a quick question to Jamal.
Yes, sir.
Knowing you from all these years, I think I've known you since 2011. So do these gigs, do the production, touring, right? So you came to the Eastern Cape as a record label manager for ECAVC. Then I just wanted to know, what was the shift from that to music education?
So when I graduated from UKZN, I went straight on the year that I graduated. I went straight to teach at Central Johannesburg College, and I taught there for many years. And after that, I taught at Wits for many years, Wits University.
Oh, sure.
And yeah, so then I started, and again, maybe this is a beautiful thing to start thinking about that I had never thought about, that I was teaching formally, but I just felt like there was a need to teach informally. And this is when I started like playing in different groups and giving whatever knowledge that I had to people that I was coming across, especially in my band, as you know, like that's really where I give all the knowledge. So I started feeling like it was important to work with a smaller group, focused and no pressure of a curriculum, but we can share knowledge that is really important to us.
Yeah.
And by extension, there was this question of when people graduate, where do they really go? And I realized what a beast this whole idea of an industry had become, and especially for people that were coming out of an academic background. And there was a divide, a serious border. On the one hand, you had musicians that were in the industry that were quote unquote very talented. And you had, on the one hand, quote unquote scholars that were really sad and bitter about not making it into the industry because these two worlds didn't belong together. So one of the things that now I would move to the Eastern Cape was I felt that there was a need for these two worlds to kind of speak to each other. And that is why a lot of the people that were signing in the record label, I was also encouraging them to go study music and vice versa, you know? And now I'm teaching students that I'm already creating opportunities for them to land in a better way than we did in the industry. So of course that informs curriculum. We have a lot of musicians that didn't go to school in a formal sense that come and do workshops here. Not only workshops about music, but also music business, also about arts administration and stuff like that. So I think the move was inspired by the fact that this border was very loud. This gap between academia and the industry was becoming so loud. So I hope that I inspire the next generation of academics that are equally great as musicians out there, but also that could have very potent contributions academically, you know. So that's really the two worlds and how I see them speak to each other.
And maybe just in closing, coming back to your earlier point, Nduduzo, how do we draw from that historical legacy?
Where personally, I think a lot of work needs to happen is, I think it was Magesh Naidu in one of the conferences that was kind of pointing towards what are the key indicators and signifiers? How do we describe South African jazz? Because, for instance, if you think about Latin America, there is a very strong accent, but also that's supported by a lot of literature that really tells us what Latin American jazz is and what it sounds like. We've seen a similar thing happening in Europe, the birth of the ECM and all of those kind of, ways of documenting a time. So in South Africa, although we all know that there's South African jazz, but we struggle with definitions.
Yeah.
Our definitions seem to always invoke a deep leaning in African American jazz, right? Which is nothing wrong, because all of it is through the transatlantic. So we understand how that came about. But I think dating as far as the 1920s, like there is ragtime records of the 20s by Galuza that were recorded already in Merenhill. So that tells us that while this was developing as an aesthetic, it started to have its own very particular voice. And I think, like I said earlier on, the discontinuity with the Berkeley kind of leaning curriculum, of course, has led us to reproducing African-American jazz. But I think there is an interest now, at least starting from Babu Zimnawana, who was also one of my teachers, who was thinking quite strongly about how jazz in the South African context stands on the folk music that he had already absorbed as a young kid, right? And we see on his records, he played a lot of repertoires that came from rites of passage, but there's a lot of memory that he brought into jazz, and that defined the way that he understood the jazz aesthetic. So I think that's the future right there. It's knowing that we have a difficult history and accepting that, but also looking for the things that refuse to be removed to kind of be forgotten, and making sure that those are plugged back onto what we define as jazz in South Africa. I mean, we have great examples of it, like, you know, Babu Hugh Masekela, he played the trumpet. He was in the US for the longest time, but it takes only one phrase for him to locate himself in a geography, in a culture, in a cosmology. So I think perhaps it's for the generation now and the generations to come to kind of look at what Masekela did and perhaps what Mam Miriam Makeba did, Mam Musim Shongo did, and take these things that have refused. This is my interest, and this is what I do in my work, and I try to filter that into curriculum. Basically, when I speak to my students, the very first class is just write me a paragraph about where you come from musically. And we try to work with that throughout the 4 years and try and invoke all of those things. This sounds like a simple idea, but actually it's about locating the students within the studies, right? And currently the students are looking elsewhere as the location for these studies. So there is an urgent need to kind of locate jazz studies in South African history, in South African cosmology, epistemology, and so that we are able to see ourselves in the studies. This is partly the greater part of the decolonial project, but I think it happens in jazz in the most kind of meaningful way. So this would be what I suggest for the futures of curriculum in South Africa.
That was so beautifully said, and I really hope that we can take these ideas forward, and that you will write more and you will play more about this, and that we will hear more about this specifically in jazz education. And I also think that is a beautiful way to end this conversation. I'd like to thank you both for your time, and thank you for joining SAJE, and thanks to our sponsor, the Samro Foundation, whom we would not be able to do all of this without the sponsorship. So we thank Samro, and I think that's a beautiful note to end our discussion on. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you.
Much love, man.
Yeah.